This is a reading of Woods Runner by Gary Paulsen, Afterword. Woods Runner is not an attempt to write the history of the war for independence. Rather, this book, along with being the story of Samuel and his parents and their part in the war, is meant to clarify some aspects of that conflict that have been often brushed over. Some of the dreadful nuts and bolts of battle, the real and horrible truths, are frequently overlooked because other parts are more dramatic and appealing. There is a tendency to clean up the tales of war to make them more palatable, focused on rousing stories of heroism and stirring examples of patriotism, all clean, pristine, and antiseptic. But the simple fact is that all combat is outrageous. Thousands and thousands of young soldiers die horrible, painful deaths, laying in their own filth, alone and far from home, weak and hallucinating, forgotten and lost. The Revolutionary War lasted for 8 long slaughtering years. Over 200,000 men between the ages of 16 and 25 answered the call in the war for independence and stood to, that often meant death. Approximately 4,400 young men were killed in combat by a musket ball, exploding artillery, grape shot from a cannon, or a steel bayonet shoved through their bodies. Disease accounted for another 30 to 50,000 losses, although it is difficult to determine accurately the numbers of wounded men who subsequently died of infection. Estimates put the figures between 15 and 30,000. Opened wounds were bathed with dirty sponges kept in pails of filthy, bloody water. Surgeons went days between washing their hands or instruments. Most of the wounded, seethed with dirt, bacteria, and infection, were sent home to die months later, well past any documented casualty roll. The total figure might be on the order of 60,000 deaths. Although accurate records of the wounded never existed, the figure is generally thought to be about 4 wounded for every man who died on the battlefield or died of disease in the camps. Back then, however, most of the wounded did not live, and so the proportion was more like 2 wounded for every man killed. That puts the total casualty figure conservatively at a staggering 100 to 110,000 out of just over 200,000 men who fought. At least half of them died. In the eastern colonies, whole towns were denuded of young men. They sent their sons and fathers and husbands off and never saw them again, not even to bury them. The men fighting and dying in the war for independence were, for the most part, average young working men with little or no military training. They were fighting the most powerful nation on earth, and they suffered those horrendous casualty rates for an appalling 8 years. That these young men and boys stood as they did in the face of withering odds and actually won, and creating a new nation with their blood, is nothing short of astonishing.